too thick and it's served warm with horseradish. Oh boy. There's about a dozen of them that gets around the greater Buffalo area, a couple of them Layton's, at least they were. But the original one was up there by the airport. I bet you could see the airport. You could have the jet flying through it. And it was just dumb. I took my mother there last night when we were driving back to Toronto. And she said, "What's this stuff you're taking me to?" I said, "You'll love it," because I knew she liked roast beef sandwiches. So we got in there, building built like in the 20s. And of course, in the lobby area, such as it was, they had all pictures, all the celebrities, all politicians who visited there.
We go there, but we go to see the falls.
Yeah. I remember seeing it when they dammed it up for one summer. The American Falls, yeah. They were doing an inspection and everything.
They find out the people living.
Well, yeah.
Oh my God. They wanted to clear out the garden bucket. See how many people took that.
Yeah, the barrel.
Or barrels.
Yeah, they go over the horseshoe ball. The American Falls is just no way, it's just all rock.
Well, a lot of it is erosion.
Oh, it's constantly moving back. It's not back 30 or 40 feet.
Yeah.
It used to be 10 miles, 15 miles, from going right on the edge of the escarpment. CSX Transportation under the CSX corporate umbrella. So the Chessie was up in the north. That was old Chesapeake in Ohio and the Baltimore in Ohio. There were B&O on the monopoly boards. Oldest railroad in America, 1828. And the seaboard was the southern part of CSX. 1991, a very vital connection railroad, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, the little railroad with the big name. 112 miles and a name that's almost as long. Was the link between Richmond and Washington, D.C., and had been owned by Chessie and Seaboard and a couple other railroads in the state of Virginia. And basically, CSX got the railroad, and the state of Virginia got the land, including a huge, several hundred acres in Alexandria, where the Potomac Yard used to be. A couple years later, a little connection up there in the Pittsburgh area, of Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, helped solidify CSX control of the vital part of the railroad that they ran over. And the big latest change was in 1997. CSX and Norfolk Southern bought Conrail and split it up. Conrail used to be the old New York Central and the Pennsylvania railroads of the old days, and Penn Central. And CSX ended up with 42% of its Conrail network up there in the Northeast and in the Midwest. Of course, we're more interested in what goes on down south here. Seaboard Coastline was the result of a merger of the Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airline Railroads in 1967. The Seaboard and Atlantic Coastline in the late 19th century put together a whole patchwork of railroads all down here in the southeast and adopted their name Seaboard and Atlantic Coastline in 1900 or so, 1902 or 40. And purple was a color often associated with Atlantic Coastline, so my friend Larry put their network in purple. That was the color of their timetables, and from 1939 to 1957, that was the color of their diesel locomotives was purple. As you can see, there's a lot of trackage down here in Central Florida. The northwestern part of the Seaboard system, the Seaboard was the Louisville National Railroad and the Mona up in Indiana there. 1983, they became the Seaboard System Railroad. And there's, what's going to break down of the Chessie and Seaboard System elements formed CSX back in 1986 or so. Oops. Okay. Using the CSX map, just to give you an idea what passenger trains ran. When Amtrak took over passenger service in May 1971, that is the CSX lines they operate on that are heavy and thick. Now, where they end, like right there, what happened there was the Amtrak train then continued on another railroad that was not that didn't become part of CSX. For instance, this was the route to Broadway Limited. that continued on here to Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, to Philadelphia, to New York. And you see there was service from Florida to Chicago. It actually continued on another railroad to Chicago. That ceased in 1979. Now, as far as like the Amtrak network today running on CSX, this is where Amtrak runs today. In the Tampa, we have the Silver Star comes in Tampa, the Silver Meteor also runs from New York to Florida, although currently it's suspended because of the crew shortages they have. And you've heard of Auto Train, perhaps, the train that you can put your car on. It runs entirely from CSX in Sanford up here to Northern Virginia. That's rather Silver Star, Capital Limited, Lakeshore Limited, and that's the the Cardinal, and it's a regional service up there in the Midwest that runs out of Chicago. You know, we talked about rails. One of the big products in Florida, of course, was the good old days was people, of course, but also citrus and phosphates. In 1888, they've been mining phosphate down here in central Florida, south of Mulberry, and down towards Arcadia. And these are the routes where it mostly goes. It goes everywhere in between here, but the biggest corridors is to Chicago, because a lot of it went to the western railroads to go to Iowa, North and South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska for the corn and the wheat. Very vital fertilizer. Some of it, of course, goes across the Gulf of New Orleans up the Mississippi River. Here's the phosphate industry in Florida. This was Hooker's Prairie Mine back in about 2001, 2002. I actually was the guy who got this locomotive named the Spirit of Mulberry, and I managed these cars that were on the train there. That's a typical phosphate rock hopper that's currently running, carrying phosphate from the mines to the processing plants, and then once it's processed, it's exported all over the world. Up until 2017, Tropicana used to run a whole train from Bradenton to New Jersey several times a week. The cars still move, but they don't move on their own dedicated train anymore. They move in regular service. And this is the big phosphate terminal that's for export phosphate. And that's a picture of it. It's called Rockport. It's owned by CSX. It's in the eastern part of Tampa, northeastern part of Tampa Bay, right adjacent to the Port of Tampa. These two big buildings hold 100,000 tons of phosphate fertilizer. And their footprint is about 1,200 feet long, about 250 feet wide. Basically, they're about the size of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. Give you an idea. And there's the ship loaders there and there that load the ships that come in. They can load a ship with 50 to 60,000 tons of the fertilizer going export. Yes, that's Causeway Boulevard, and that's Hooker's Point over there. That's part of the Port of Tampa. Highway 60 and 50th Street's back up that way. So if this pan a little bit to the left, you can see downtown Tampa. The entrance is over here on Highway 41, 50th Street. This is the network of freight railroads in North America today. CSX is shown here on the bottom right in gold coming into Florida. Norfolk Southern is in black. The Canadian Pacific is in blue up in Canada, and you can see where they operate down into the U.S. and the Midwest and the Northeast. The Canadian National actually runs all the way down to New Orleans, having acquired a couple other American railroads over the last decades and all that. Out west, you have the famous Union Pacific, which was part of the first transcontinental line from Omaha to the San Francisco Bay Area, and Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF for short. And in between in the middle is Kansas City Southern. It just got bought by Canadian Pacific. It runs from Mexico to the Midwest. Call it the Big Six and the wannabe little seven railroad. But you can see where it's all networked. And basically, you can load a car here in Tampa and go anywhere on this network with the various railroads. There's actually other railroads that are not shown that are little like branch line railroads. Like, for instance, it doesn't show the Florida East Coast that runs down the East Coast here. There's various other what they call short lines that operate small branch line operations. There's the major gateways where CSX connects with all that network. When you're shipping out of here, you want to take it as far as possible, so you don't give it to the Canadian National in New Orleans, you give it to them in Chicago. Yeah, if you originate, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? If you're originating it, you can take it as far as you want. As I mentioned here, going back to the 1880s and 1990s, primary commodities in Florida was tourists. Everybody heard of Henry Plant?
Oh, yeah.
Henry Flagler? Yeah, we'll touch on those guys a little bit later. Citrus, phosphates, produce, of course, and forest products. A lot of timber and lumber used to be down here. In fact, a lot of those branch lines you saw was CSX in Florida, all started as lumber railroads. And they were just put together by aggregated together. As I mentioned before, the Florida East Coast, and the Southern Railroad, Louisville, Nashville got up the little bits in Florida in the past. So Atlantic Coastline, like I said, was formed in 1900 is when it adopted the Atlantic Coastline name. In 1902 is when the Atlantic Coastline bought the plant system here in Central Florida, gaining access to the Tampa Bay area. Henry Plant lived 1819 to 1989, was Florida's West Coast developer of local rail lines, steamboats, major hotels in Tampa, the Bellevue Biltmore.
Mm-hmm.
And from a lot of that time, from 1900 to 1960, the Atlantic Coastline was headquartered in Wilmington, North Carolina. And in 1960, they moved to Jacksonville, Florida, which is now the corporate headquarters for CSX. One thing I didn't mention, I'm on two historical society groups. I'm the president of the Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airline Railroad Historical Society. We have about 800 members. We actually have archives in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which we kind of know what's there, but we got to organize it.
Yeah.
I do know there's a drawer. There's at least 1 or 2 filing cabinet drawers from 1958 and 59 when the Atlantic Coastline put out, say, hey, who wants us? when they
Please buy us.
When they moved out of Wilmington, I mean, Atlanta, Birmingham, all the big cities in some towns you never heard of, put into the name, and they ended up in Jacksonville. So we actually have all those proposals from those cities.
Wow.
Our archives. It's kind of fun. I'm also on the board of directors of Friends of Tampa Union Station, which is a 501c3 that helps the city of Tampa, the owner, and Amtrak, the tenant, with the station. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So, Atlantic Coastline in 1967, down at the bottom, merged with its parallel rival, really, the Seaboard Airline Railroad, that formed Seaboard Coastline. Seaboard Airline. Now you're probably wondering, airline, 1900? Jeepers, the Wright brothers hadn't even flown by then, right?
Yeah.
Although the crazy old Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, he was flying his airships, his Zeppelins, in Germany back at that time. But 19th century, early 20th century, an airline was a straight line or a straight through route. So they prided themselves as being the through route from Virginia to Florida. And I'll tell you, their main line wasn't all that straight. It wandered a little bit, as they all do. And while the northern part of CSX dated back to 1828 with the Baltimore, Ohio, the seaboard wasn't far behind, dating back to 1832 with the Portsmouth and Roanoke Railroad. If you go back to the histories of the railroads, like Seaboard Airline, there'd be dozens and dozens of an alphabet soup of railroads, like the Roanoke and Weldon and this and that and everything else, all named for towns and intermediate places. And so it's funny with some of the names, like there was a railroad called the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, commonly known as the Frisco, and it disappeared in the 70s when Burlington Northern bought them out. Well, they started in St. Louis, kind of went west a bit, mostly went south to Birmingham, and never got anywhere near San Francisco.
But it had a plan.
And like the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. It did get to Santa Fe, but it wasn't on the main line. It was a little dinky branch line. They ended up going south to where Santa Fe, New Mexico was. So anyway, Seaboard, they adopted the name in 1900 as well. And they were headquartered in Portsmouth, Virginia until 1958 when they moved to Richmond, Virginia. In the 1920s, they had an interesting president, S. Davies Warfield. He was a key figure in Florida expansion. He expanded the seaboard in southwest Florida, and also, more importantly, he built the seaboard extension from Coleman, Florida, to Auburndale, to Winter Haven, Okeechobee, West Palm Beach, and Miami. Coleman's town just south of Wildwood. And that was completed just in time for the start of the Great Depression in 1929. But it actually worked out for them because they had direct access to Miami. The Atlantic Coastline didn't. they had to give their freight cars and their passenger trains to the Florida East Coast and Jacksonville, Florida to get to Miami. So anyway, interesting enough, Mr. Davies, while he was there, president of the 20s, the Seaboard built a business car for him named the Baltimore. The Seaboard never went to Baltimore, but it was named Baltimore because that's where he was from. And that car today is still in service with CSX, and from about 88 until just a year or two ago, it might still have a Baltimore name on it, but it was named in Virginia for a while, the Alabama, and then it got renamed back to Baltimore about 1987. Now, the name Davies sounds familiar. That's because he was the uncle of Wallace Warfield Simpson, the lady who became the Duke of Windsor, Duchess of Windsor, who married King Edward VIII, the guy I advocated for, the woman he loved. That was his niece. So anyway, I mentioned there about the extension going on from Wildwood down to Palm Beach in 1925 and Miami in 1926. Actually, yeah, prior to the Depression of 1929, of course, there was the big land bust in Florida, followed closely by the Depression. Seaboard was always the underdog to the Atlantic coastline. The Atlantic coastline kind of served more the prime industries and all that, had more money and profitability. In fact, in a lot of the 30s, the Seaboard airline was in receivership. But that meant that they had to be feisty and try and compete. They were the first railroad in Florida to operate air-conditioned coaches in 1933. They also were the first to install reclining seats of coaches on the Florida trains in 1936. The old coach seats were worse than airline seats. They didn't recline. 1938, the Seaboard was the first railroad in Florida to dieselize its premier passenger train, the Orange Blossom Special, with brand new diesel locomotives built by Electromotive Corporation, which later became a division of General Motors. In fact, by 1939, when the Seaboard offered the first streamlined passenger train, the Atlantic coastline was still building steam locomotives for its passenger trains.
Oh, wow.
So in 1939, in February, the Seaboard inaugurated the Silver Meteor. It was only one set of equipment, 7 cars, made a round trip between New York and Florida every third day, and was very successful. It was cheaper to run than the steam train. It had brand new deluxe air-conditioned coaches, which reclined. They were like luxury, and had a diner and a tavern car. And no sleepers, but it was all coach, because in those days, the railroads got all the money from the coach passengers, but when on the sleepers, they were operated by the Pullman Company. The railroad got the rail fare, but the Pullman Company got the first class portion and the charges. So for these streamliners, all the money was theirs. So it was so successful, within 3 or 4 months, they ordered 2 more train sets so they could maintain daily service from New York and Florida. And guess what? The Atlantic coastline saw that their traffic was down, so they said, we have to have some of those too. So in December, on the same day in December 1939, the Silver Meteor began daily service out of New York's Penn Station. The same day, the Atlantic coastline inaugurated its nearly identical streamliner named the Champion. They actually had a contest for that name, and the name Champion was selected. And there was also denials that it had nothing to do with the fact that the president of the Atlantic coastline at that time was Champion Davis.
That was just by accident.
Yeah, just by accident, I suppose. We talked about Henry Flagler a little bit. Henry Flagler, of course, was the guy who built the railroad down the East Coast. He made his money in standard. He was the brains of Ford. He was the partner of Rockefeller in Standard Oil. Rockefeller was the wheeler and dealer. Flagler was the guy who made sure it was more or less done legally, and was the detail guy, the accountant guy. And so he ended up with a lot of money. In 1983, we decided to retire to St. Augustine. Once he was there, he realized he thought the railroad service between St. Augustine and Jackson was terrible, so he bought the railroad and decided to start building hotels. And so he bought the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Railroad. Now, see when I mentioned about all these names that are an alphabet soup of initials? And after getting that straightened out in St. Augustine, he decided to head south, steading down to Daytona Beach in 89, 94, 1894 is in West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale in 1996, Miami in 1896, I'm sorry, and then all the way down to Homestead in 1902. And after that, the giant, really ambitious thing was the Overseas Railroad to Key West. Now, he died while it was still under construction, but it was finished in 1912, and then, of course, it was badly damaged by the Labor Day hurricane in 1935, which was never restored in service because we never really made money on that part. But back in those days, you could take a Pullman sleeper from New York to Key West on a Atlantic coastline and Florida East Coast Railroad passenger train, and then you would disembark in Key West and get on a ferry operated by the P&O ferry line to go to Havana.
Yahoo!
Which was the big party place to go to back in the day. So anyway, passengers were really big for these railroads up until, the 60s, really. And of course, it was the only way to travel for a long time. Atlantic coastline, as I mentioned, came all the way down to Jacksonville. Atlantic coastline and Seaboard got as far north as Richmond. Then their trains went on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac to Washington, and the Pennsylvania Railroad from Washington to New York. It was a joint through service, and both the Pennsylvania and the Atlantic coastline actually contributed some cars to those trains. So that's why you can see Pennsylvania and Richmond, Fredericksburg, Potomac cars in Seaboard and Atlantic coastline passenger trains back in the day. And it was kind of a portion based upon their mileage. So the RFP didn't have very many, because they only had 112 with a 1,200-mile trip. Of course, the big train on the the Atlantic coastline was the Florida Special. Back in those days, well, business was very seasonal. Before it was was December to April. The rest of the year was dead. So there were some trains that ran only during that winter season period. The Florida Special was their famous train. In fact, I just completed an article that was published in Line South this month, our PCL, Clearwater Historical Society, on the last Florida Special, which was actually operated by Amtrak in 1971-72. It was a fantastic train. They had another train called the Havana Special. We just mentioned about the Champion, which was their first streamlined stainless steel UH train in 1939. The Vacationer was another seasonal train they ran, and then there was another train called the Palmetto, and there were probably a couple others that came and went over the decades. Seaboard Airlines' famous named train was the Orange Blossom Special, and it was seasonal, and it was the counterpart to the Florida Special. In 1950, the Atlantic coastline actually had the money to buy new streamlined cars for their Florida Special, even though it was a seasonal train. Seaboard couldn't afford that luxury. So after 1953, they discontinued their Orange Blossom Special and instead added more cars to the Silver Meteor and the Silver Star. So as I mentioned, the Silver Meteor was the first streamliner. That name is still maintained by Amtrak today. And its kid sister was the Silver Star, was introduced in 1947. And that train, of course, comes into Tampa now these days. The third train of the Silver Fleet was the Silver Comet, which ran from New York to Atlanta and Birmingham. They had a secondary train named the Palmland, and the Gulf Wind was a joint train between the Louisville, Nashville, and the Seaboard that ran from Jacksonville to New Orleans until about I think it made it to Amtrak, 1971. And then the Florida East Coast, they handled the Atlantic coastline trains, and there were also, I mentioned there, the Illinois Central and Pennsylvania Railroad, those are those initials. Railroad guys are into initials. It's easier to say R&P than Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, right? There were trains, passenger trains in the Midwest of Florida. The Illinois Central was probably offered the best. Their flagship was the streamliner City of Miami that started in 1940. Everybody was getting into streamliners right before World War II. And basically it ran on the Illinois Central down into Alabama, and then on the Atlantic coastline to Jacksonville and the Florida East Coast to Miami. They had a secondary train named the Seminole. The Pennsylvania Railroad actually had a train called the Southwind. That was their streamliner of 1940. And it ran down via the Pennsylvania to Louisville, and then the Louisville, Nashville, and Atlantic coastline and Florida East Coast to Miami. Southern Railway operated a train named the Royal Palm from Cincinnati to Jacksonville. They had through cars that went beyond, as well as north up to Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago. I left out one other railroad, the Chicago and Eastern Illinois ran a train from Chicago to Florida too, which connected with an L&N affiliate. But it kind of just lasted to about 1955, which got the Dixie flag. 1950s, this is what the locomotives looked like. The top one there is an E6. It's the only surviving E6 in the world, number 501. I must correct myself. That is incorrect. It's an E3, which was built on 1939, 1940 locomotive. It's preserved in Spencer, another type over in North Carolina. Yes, that's purple, silver, and gold. That was the route. That was the colors of the Atlantic coastline then. The Seaboard in 1957 changed theirs. That's not white. That's actually a pale mint green and red. Prior to that, their locomotives, their passenger locomotives, were painted a dark green with orange and red, orange and gold accents. It was called the citrus paint scheme. It's really hard to find good color photos of that. And the Florida East Coast, well, jeepers, isn't that kind of pull your eyeballs out? There's the orange and the red and so forth. By the 1960s, though, the railroad started getting cheap. You can imagine those paint schemes. Like the Atlantic coastline with the purple, that purple would fade within 3 years. That's when we paint the locomotives every 3 years. Heck, nowadays it's like you get a locomotive repainted once every 15 or 20 years. So Atlantic coastline went to basic black. And that became the colors of the Seaboard coastline, although some of the Seaboard coastline locomotives in the Seaboard airline having a patch on there. Remember when U.S. Air took over Piedmont? You saw all these Piedmont planes with a U.S. Air sticker on it. Mm-hmm. That's what that is. We call it in our hobby, our history side, the split image paint schemes. Mm-hmm. And the Florida East Coast went to basic blue. These are some famous cars that ran into Florida. The top two ran on the Silver Meteor. This was the first class Pullman Buffet lounge car known as a Sun Lounge. Only 3 were built. One still operates, available in charter service. It's named Hollywood Beach. And right here on the table is a model of Hollywood Beach in Oakskill. That was for the first class passengers only, but the coach passengers had these beautiful round-end tavern observation cars on the rear of the Silver Meteor, which you could enjoy a beer, liquor, a smoke, or whatever, and sodas and some snacks. The Royal Palm, which didn't last very long, had these beautiful high-windowed sleeper observations that ran from Cincinnati to Miami. And then in the 1960s, the Atlantic coastline and later Seaboard coastline leased and then bought these Baltimore and Ohio dome sleepers. And they ran on the Florida Special during the season and the Silver Star during the rest of the year between Richmond and Miami. They couldn't go north because of the tunnels in New York and Philadelphia. Actually, let me go back there a second. CSX just bought one of these. There were only 3 of these domes built. And CSX just bought one and made it to part of their business car fleet recently. All the freight railroads still have these private cars. Talking about private cars, I bring this up because they used to come to the Bellevue Biltmore. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, if you were really wealthy, you owned your own car. Like you had your own Gulfstream jetliner now, or you had your railway car. And if you didn't want to own one, you could go to the Pullman company and lease them for the week, for the month. Take the family up to Grand Canyon, what the heck. This car was built as an individual's car for a fellow named Keenan, who was the trustee of the Florida East Coast Railroad. Eventually ended up being owned by the Florida East Coast. It was named the Ranley. That's the car on the top. And that car today is still in the CSX business car fleet today. It's changed names a couple of times, the Washington, the Waycross. I'm not sure what name they put on it recently. They put the deal where they changed a lot of cars. Now, the plan below isn't that particular car, but it's similar. Be it a railroad business car or a railroad office car, as some railroads call them, or official car, or a private individual's car. They generally feature here on the left, on the rear of the car, an open platform, where you can make your speech as the superintendent of the division or as the presidential candidate. An observation lounge, then anywhere from 2 to 4 staterooms of various sizes. Of course, the bigger ones are for the guy, the bigger wig, the head honcho. Private dining room, and then you have a buffet and a kitchen, a pantry, and a little quarters for a crew where you have a cook and a steward. This is a more modern car that's in private ownership today. It was actually built for Canadian National about 1959. It was more a modern streamlined car, so it only has 3 axles underneath each end instead of, or 2 axles instead of 3. But it's the same idea: kitchen, crew secretary. One of those rooms is usually assigned to the secretary. That was a guy who was usually the lawyer, who was the corporate secretary for the president or the vice president, as an assistant. Sometimes it might actually be a male secretary stenographer as well, because these cars were used as business, for office, for business purposes, and sometimes, as well as inspecting the railroad. And this particular car only had two large staterooms, but it had the third room for the corporate secretary and the observation lounge.
These have to be pulled, or
What's that?
do they run by themselves?
Oh, no. They're put in the back of the train, right? And quite often, they put it back on the rear of the train. For instance, I know a couple CSX presidents I knew pretty well. Amtrak served Jacksonville, and the Silver Meteor left at dinner time, and arrived in Richmond at 6 in the morning. That was corporate headquarters for CSX Corp. I know that. They're pretty cool, and there's still a few around that you can charter, and the freight railroads. In fact, Amtrak has a car. Has a car like that. Talking about Amtrak, here's Amtrak in the 70s, down near Okeechobee up here, and this is actually here in Clearwater back in 1982. That's our auto train service, which was restarted in 1983, 84, and then, of course, it continues on today with the double-deck cars that they use. And just wrapping up on this part of the presentation, this is Tampa Union Station. We'll talk a bit more of that in the next presentation, which we'll get on to right now. Let me just launch it up.
Now, what if they had more than one private train? Let's say Mr. Jones wanted one and Mr. Smith wanted one.
Well, whoever was most senior would be on the rear.
Okay, so
Yeah, and that's how you mentioned Mr. Smith. Rich Smith was the president of the Seaport in 1960.
Oh, I just made that name up.
Yeah.
What was the advantage of being the last car?
You can see what's going on. You can see your empire holding behind you.
Probably the woods and then the hotel, or it was looking for
I know what we did was we ran two of them, we put them back to back so the platforms would be checked. Because going from an open platform to the next car, it's a little more hairy, but I've done that too. Okay. Now we're gonna see if I get the widescreen format now. We're gonna focus in on Tampa Bay now. The railways of Tampa Bay. A lot of the photographs here I've taken from Tom Pavlichek's collection. It's on Flickr. I hadn't told Tom about this yet. I'll probably give him a call. He is a member of our historical society. I'm sure he'll be fine with it. So let's otherwise, these photos are by him or from his collection. In fact, Fred Clark, who I've met, he actually took this photo back in 1981. This is the trestle up in Oldsmar, and it's Silver Meteor. At that time, used to have a section that ran all the way to St. Petersburg. And when Amtrak came about, of course, they ended up owning 1,200 cars and railroads all over the country, and they moved stuff around here and there and everywhere. It's kind of interesting. That locomotive is a locomotive that Amtrak bought in the late 1970s for their trains. The baggage cars from the 50s from the Santa Fe Railroad, and I can actually tell these three coaches are Southern Pacific coaches built in the 1950s for the Sunset Limited. I can tell because these big square rectangular plaques is where they used to have the Sunset Limited name there in the card number. So the other car, I can't quite see enough of it to figure out what the heck it is. It might, I'm not sure, it's probably a Santa Fe car or something. But anyway, so a lot of the Western Railroad cars ended up in the east, and a lot of the Eastern cars ended up on the west. They kind of went everywhere. Here's just my little introduction again. Here's my little push on the Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airline Historical Society. Our membership's only $42 now. We just took it up from $35. Our costs went up. We print a quarterly magazine, and if you go to the website, aclsl.org, or just search Atlantic Coastline Historical Society, we've got a fun website with lots of information on there. We actually have 2 or 3 issues of our magazine that you can see what kind of articles we do and so forth. One interesting thing about Seaboard Coastline, See this locomotive, 1776? Our seaboard coastline started a fad. In 1971 or so, they took delivery of a locomotive number 1776 from General Electric, the U-36B, and it was in their basic black and yellow, like the locomotives right behind it, back in 1737. Somebody came up with the idea of cheapers, forget the bicentennial coming up, and they called up GE, and they delivered a second 1776. The other one was renumbered something else, and General Electric and Seaboard Coastline came up with this paint scheme. By 1976, there were 400 red, white, and blue locomotives across the country. Everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And we were the first. And what was really neat, they actually had spotlights down there. So at night, they would illuminate the Great Seal, and you see there's a special a bronze bell mounted right in front of the window. Usually they're either on the rooftop or hidden in behind the pilot. So we're kind of proud of that. Tampa Bay. So this is in the late 19th century. Oh, by the way, our society was established in '83, so next year we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. A lot of names you probably never heard of. The Orange Belt Railroad, the Southern Florida Railroad, South Florida Railroad, Peninsula Railroad. Well, what's here in red is Southern Railroad. That one became the plant system and eventually Atlantic Coastline. The Orange Belt there, that was also bought by Atlantic Coastline by the turn of the century. Of course, the plant system didn't get bought by Atlantic Coastline until 1992. This green line here became the Seaboard Airline Railroad, with their big town being Wildwood. Later on, that's where the railroads, they split the East Coast and West Coast. Wildwood was a big town. It was a crew change point. It was where they actually had steam locomotive shop. They also had an ice house there for putting ice into refrigerated cars to carry produce northeast. That's not the only railroads that were in Central Florida. For instance, out of Tampa, running up here to Brooksville and beyond, was the Tampa Northern, which I don't have any map of. Then here's the Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad. This is 1915. Allison, you and I were talking about which way, after looking at this map, they might have been started in St. Petersburg, went around up to Clearwater, Oldsmar, and down over to Tampa, and all the way up to Fort Ritchie and Tarpon Springs. So it's quite possible that they went that way, because that's as far as they ever got.
Right.
and in the sometime in the teens or early 20s, it became part of Seaboard. Now, it actually got into Tampa Union Station, which opened in 1912, but it was not part of the team. Tampa Union Station was built by the Atlantic Coastline, the Seaboard Airline, and the Tampa Northern. The Gulf Coast Railroad, Florida Gulf Coast Railroad, Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad, they had an operating agreement with trackage rights where they could operate in. So they paid to get in there, but they didn't pay to have the place built. And actually, at Tampa Union Station, we actually have some of the train ledgers from 1912.
Oh, wow.
That document all the arrivals and departures, the names of the trains, the locomotives, the cars on the trains, and all that. And Tampa Gulf Coast, they had a coach and a mail car and a steam locomotive. That was about it. Now today, and you see here, it shows the Atlantic coastline here, which was the Orange Belt. Now you're familiar with Pinellas Trail.
Yes.
Well, from Clearwater, the two lines crisscrossed each other right here, just not too far from where we're sitting. And the southern part of the Pinellas Trail was the Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad, aka later the Seaboard. From Clearwater north up to Tarpon Springs, it's on the former Atlantic coastline right away. Fast forward to the 1920s, all those other alphabet soup things are gone. You just got Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airline. The Tampa Northern was bought by Seaboard as well in the 1920s. And in this case, the map, the green is the Seaboard Airline, which is appropriate because their locomotives are painted green. And then the red is the Atlantic Coastline lines. And you'll see, to get from Tampa to Pinellas County, Seaboard could go up and around. Atlantic Coastline had to go all the way back up to Trilby, in fact, if they actually wanted to route something that way. which had a big impact on how they got their pasture daughters in the Tampa Bay for the Atlantic coastline. Atlantic coastline in Jacksonville, their Miami cars would run down the FEC, and then their cars to St. Petersburg would take this looping line from Baldwin to Gainesville to Ocala to Leesburg, then Ellen, Trilby, Tarpon Springs, and down to St. Petersburg. To get to Tampa, they actually took this other route here on the far right, which is what Amtrak uses today, which is Jacksonville, Palatka, Orlando, Kissimmee, Lakeland, Plant City, Tampa, and that's where the Atlantic coastline terminated. This Amtrak, of course, they used the seaboard route up around through Oldsmar. They used to come over to St. Petersburg until 1984 or so. So the seaboard came down from Jacksonville through Baldwin, never got to Gainesville, went through Walden instead, just east of that famous town with the cops who like to pull people over, and Ocala, and then Wildwood. And if just the Wildwood doesn't show up, the trains to Miami would split out that way. And they came on down through Zephyr Hills, Plant City, and on into Tampa. And could come into Tampa Union Station and would back out, turn around, and go up around through Oldsmar to the water of St. Pete.
You didn't have a roundhouse?
No, well, to turn a train one car at a time is impractical. I'll show you, I'll talk about how they turn a train around. Tampa was a dead-end station, essentially.
Okay.
And it still is. So when Amtrak comes in there, they actually either back in or back up. They actually back in there. I'll tell you how they do that in a little bit. Good question, though. This is Clearwater, 1940. To the left is north. We're in Fort Harrison, so we're right down around here, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Between Turner and Druid.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's a little blurry as far as it's kind of small. But on the north side here is the seaboard line that's still there. That's the CSX line today. The Seaboard Depot, Seaboard had two depots. They had a passenger station here, and a couple blocks northward was their freight depot. Now that was for less than carload business. There was no UPS or Federal Express back then, so you sent it Railway Express or railroad. The Atlantic coastline was further back over here, and they had a combination passenger freight depot here, north of the seaboard facilities. And we'll see some aerials that you can still see where some of these tracks used to be. Now over here, the seaboard took a right heading towards the coast, and that's now with the Pinellas Trail. And the Atlantic coastline crossed from there, although the seaboard also had a branch that went to Largo for a little bit of a distance. And then here is a switch that backs off that went to from the Atlantic coastline that went to the hotel. We'll see that a little bit more detail here in a couple of minutes. So we're zooming in here on the downtown part here. So you see where the ACL depot was at Garden Avenue and Cleveland Street. There's the Seaboard Freight Depot. We got pictures of these coming up here shortly. And then the last those to get torn down, unfortunately, was the Seaboard Depot. It was owned by the pension penny guys.
Oh.
And they turned, after Amtrak, gave it up years ago, they turned it into a hot dog place. It was pretty nice. And it was right beside one of their pension pennies.
Yeah.
And then the city got on their case, well, you don't have the code requirement parking space for your pension penny. So they tore down the station.
Yeah.
So that is very unfortunate. See this little diamond here? SY 875 is the number. On railroad maps, you'll see those all over the place. That's a milepost.
Okay.
The S means it was, different railroads have different nomenclature. On the Seaboard coastline, S was a seaboard line, A was an Atlantic coastline line. So S designates as the seaboard, and Y means it's the Y split. So there'd be different letters before the numbers. For instance, over that big Rockport port facility, that's an AZA 882, Atlantic coastline on the ZA branch. So you get all that stuff, but it actually makes sense.
It makes sense.
And guess where 875 is?
75?
That's the miles. If you follow the Seaboard main line, out that branch onto the main line, that's the mileage to the James River in Richmond, Virginia. And that's where the milepost 0 was for the Atlantic coastline as well.
It's like a highway at that point.
Yes, it's just like the milepost, except for it's all the way up to Virginia. Now here's a close-up. Remember we saw where they crisscrossed here on the south end of town? This is a close-up here. You see SY 876. And over here you see, I think it's AGE or something, 883. Well, A is for Atlantic Coastline. And so that milepost in the ground there was 883 miles to the James River because they kind of wobbled around a little bit to get up there. And this is a close-up of the spur to the Baltimore, to the Bellevue Biltmore Hotel, which actually later was another connection was made this way. And we'll see that in one of the next slides. And of course, these roads are all still here, so they show up in the aerials. It's quite remarkable. This is different orientation. North is now up like it normally is. This is a rough schematic of that same crisscross area here in town. And at this point, you see there's two connections here. And this here is a close-up of a Sanborn map from the 1920s. Sanborn was a insurance agency, I think. They documented everything everywhere. Now, this track structure like this is called a Y, because it's like a Y, but with a, so there's the Y, and the Y is capped off at the top. You would use a Y to turn a whole bloody train.
Oh.
For instance, you're coming in from up north, you'd run the Y down to the hotel, and then you could back out this way, and then go back north. And that's exactly how Amtrak gets in the Tampa Union Station. They come in from Lakeland, and they run a Y down east of Ybor, down around 30th Street. They stop here, dispatcher gives them this switch back and this switch, clears them, and you break this, and they continue, and they back on down to Ybor City, and the chickens all scurry out of the way, and there's a conductor in the back with a little peanut whistle, the blowing the whistle off the airline, and they back into Tampa Union Station and drop everybody off and pick people up. So anyway, so that's the Y down there. And you can also use the turn an individual car, for instance. This is how it looks today with the CSX line running down here on the old Seaboard right away. They got a little spur there where they can store the locomotives and a couple of little side tracks and a little office. And this little hash line here is Pinellas Trail, which actually runs right down the same street that CSX runs today now, and then goes back here to the original right-of-way where the Atlantic Coastline, or the Seaboard Airline used to run. Well, this would be Atlantic Coastline to here, because it went that way to St. Pete, and then the Seaboard went like here, and then so right here is where it changes to the Seaboard on the south side of town as far as the right-of-way of the Pinellas Trail is. After we were talking the other night, I pulled these off of Google Maps.
You're like, okay.
There's that crisscross.
Yeah.
That's the Seaboard line. It went down like that. The Atlantic Coastline line went like this. That's right where they crisscross. And you can see where the ACL line kind of disappears. It used to run up through here. And here's the property that's where the hotel is and the golf club. That's just a close-up of where the stations used to be. It's all gone, so there's not that much to see there. And that's a close-up of that connection. And of course, this is where the Y used to be. Was right down this street is where the Y went to the Bellevue and Biltmore.
The other property that we own, the Plum House, they actually took it down the train station from Lake Bellevue.
Okay.
From Lakeview, they took it down the railroad station and then took it into that park right there at Lake Bellevue. And that's where it stands today. They did that in '83.
Okay. Well, there's other little depots were in Pinellas County. So there's an aerial view again of that crisscross area. And almost right here, almost looks like the remnant of that north part of the leg of the Y, and of course the line to the hotel went right down through here, and the other leg of the Y went over this way. Here's the Sanborn map of the Bellevue Hotel. And I guess there's a chunk of it still exists. This chunk here, and
Yeah, the original part.
it's been turned and moved.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed on the aerials. So they actually had a set-out track down here, and the servants' quarters. Boy, of course they used to fire as many servants as guests going back in those days. And this is where the rail line was. ACL Railroad. And there's a view, you can see actually get some freight cars there, probably for their food and supplies, or the guests' extensive, baggage train for the summer.
For the
winter, yeah. Like our movie Titanic, like all these trunks and everything they're traveling with. And of course down here, they actually pull the train all the way back into there. Now this wasn't uncommon to have service like this. Up in, over in Palm Beach, the Breakers was the Flagler Hotel. They actually built a line off the Florida East Coast in West Palm Beach with a bridge across Lake Worth to bring private cars directly to the Breakers Hotel. Up in St. Augustine, this Florida East Coast has moved out of it, but there were a couple buildings. There was the original Florida East Coast headquarters, and it had some set-up tracks, probably for their business car, but also for private cars, because there were a couple of Flagler hotels were right adjacent to that headquarters. French Lick, Indiana, they had a resort where people would bring their private cars in from Chicago, from New York. It was served by the Monon Railroad, which was the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad, CIL. And French Lick, Indiana, it was one of those spas that had sulfur waters. It was one of those kind of places.
Yeah.
In fact, they had their own brand. It was Pluto water, and they actually shipped it bottled around the country in refrigerated cars with a devil with a pitchfork on the side.
Nice.
Pluto water. And there's examples of those all over the country. Even in New York City, in Grand Central, there was a set-off private track for underneath one of the hotels adjacent to Grand Central Terminal for private railroad cars. And this is definitely the 1890s.
Before they painted it.
Yeah. I was at, there's a hotel in Canada, Le Chateau Montebello. Used to be the Scenery Club. And it's huge, and it's all made out of wood. It's in Montebello, Quebec, in Ottawa, and Montreal. It's all, was bought by the Canadian Pacific Hotel chain. It's now a Fairmont.
Oh, okay.
That's the track where they actually got off. As mentioned there, they didn't have any valves, they just had it right in the grass. They insisted on that, that pastoral look. And that's the Pinellas Special. We got pictures of this train coming out of Tampa Union Station, actually.
Oh, wow.
I wonder how they did that. Must have gone all the way up to Trophy back, because the line coastline didn't come straight over. Anyway. So this is the Seaboard Station that Pitchpenny guys tore down in 1959. I hate to say that.
We won't tell Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, so that's Mint Green. That's an older style heavyweight baggage coach, and then streamlined coaches and sleepers. That's the St. Petersburg section, the West Coast section of the Silver Meteor. They didn't get like this special lounge car and the tavern. That went to Miami. They just got a diner, and so they the grand stuff went down there. Although the Champion was primarily a West Coast train. Well, of course, it's still a big Tampa. So this is just 15, 16 years later when Amtrak was serving it in the 70s. The Amtrak blue columns on their sign. Their big, brand new SDP 40F locomotives. That's a mouthful too.
Yeah.
North part of town, this was the former Atlantic Coastline Depot at Cleveland Street. You can see where it's got the freight section over here. I didn't find a picture of the freight depot that Seaboard had. So that was for Freight and Express, and that was the passenger depot. This is looking the other way, the freight end of the building. You see the track over there. That was where the express cars would go right up against the loading dock in the freight section. And this is, 1968 or 69, this floor was demolished. After they merged Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard, they made connections so that the ACL could use the Seaboard depot in town there. Now, what's interesting here is the Atlantic Coastline passenger cars were primarily stainless steel as well. But once again, with the West Coast section, they got an older style baggage car, and that's probably a cafe car or something there. But you notice these two cars that are orange and brown back there. Well, here's the deal. The Champions cars in St. Petersburg ran this way. But by 1968, the Champion cars in St. Petersburg instead came into Tampa and we used the Seaboard line around to get to St. Petersburg. But the West Coast Champion of St. Petersburg also used to carry through cars from Chicago. And some of those cars were from the Illinois Central. And those are Illinois Central cars. It's probably a coach and a sleeper. Their passenger trains were painted steel with that orange and chocolate brown with the gold separation stripe. And so those cars would come off the city of Miami in Jacksonville and would go on the West Coast Champion St. Petersburg section all the way around on that meandering thing through Gainesville and Trilby and all the way over to here. Well, after Seaboard Coastline came about, like I said, they decided to simplify the West Coast Champion and run it all the way through Tampa and around the top of the bay instead of coming across through Dunellen. But they kept that local train going from Jacksonville to Baldwin to Gainesville to Ocala to Trilby to St. Petersburg. To serve local passengers, so they weren't abandoning the local service. And the Chicago sleepers from the south from the Illinois Central City, Miami, and on alternate days, they need stainless steel cars or Tuscan red cars from the Pennsylvania South Wing. Continued to run that way, and I suspect they did it to make it kind of clean because their Tampa Champion would have been a little bit bigger because it was handling all these Atlantic Coastline cars. Plus, probably the Chicago passengers, probably a lot of them were going to Ocala.
Mhm.
You know, that was the blue blood, area for part of the state, with the horsey set. And so anyway, so those Chicago cars continued to go that old route around that way. In 1971, when Amtrak took over, those West Coast cars ended up going to Tampa after all. This branch line train going from Trilby and Ocala and Allen ceased. And the city of Miami was not picked up by Amtrak, the South Wind was. Well, here's an interesting site in 1971. When Amtrak came about in 1971, one of the things they inherited were two United Aircraft Corporation turbo trains that had been built by the Department of Transportation in the 60s. They were high-speed trains. They were done at the same time that the US DOT and Pennsylvania built the Metroliners, which ran between New York and Washington. These turbo trains were gas turbine powered. These are the same gas turbines that were used on the Huey helicopter from the Vietnam era. And they were intended for use, well, a variety of places, but primarily the two trains were built ran from New York Central, from the New York's Grand Central Terminal to Boston on the Navy route. Mm-hmm. And they actually could run on electricity into Grand Central and little motors inside it as well. So Amtrak inherited the two trains. There were only 3 cars at that time. You get the 2 power cars at each end, which there was actually passenger seating up here behind the engineer, and there was a coach in the middle. About 1972, they added 2 more cars to each of the trains, so it became a 5-car train, and they settled down in service between New York and Boston for about 4 years. And by 1971, Amtrak sent one to Washington, where it ran up to West Virginia for a while, which is one of the worst places the train could run.
I was gonna say.
Because it was going up and down hills, you're not going to. And the other one was sent on a barnstorming tour of America, say, hey, this is the future. This train still holds the record, speed record, for a production, it went into actual service, a production passenger train in North America, 170 miles per hour.
Wow.
There is a section of 24 miles of relatively straight track on the northeast corridor, north of Trenton and south of Brunswick, New Brunswick, New Jersey, that's known as the Speedway in the business. And that's where all the American speed records are set. Metroliner did about 160 along there. The Acela Express, the Amtrak's Acela Express train, it tested 160 along there, but Turbo Train outdid it by doing 170. There were 2 built estates. United Aircraft kind of designed them. It actually was from a concept in the 50s. And Pullman Standard built the aluminum bodies.
Okay.
Because they had the railroad experience. United Aircraft had the turbine technology. 5 more were built in Canada for the Canadian National Railway by Montreal Local Motor Works in Montreal to the same design as with United Aircraft. They were more successful because they actually, they had some problems between 68 and 70 where they ran them and they had to take them out of service for modifications. They built 5 of them, 5 7-car trains. And after 1971, they rebuilt them into 3 9-car trains. And they operated for over 10 years between Montreal and Toronto as the premier high-speed service. They actually tested and had the Canadian speed record of 139 miles per hour with a 9-car train.
Wow.
Somewhere down near Cornwall, Ontario, they did that on a stretch of the Canadian national name. But none of them are gone. None of them are left. They were all scrapped out after that. When Canadian National realigned theirs from 5 train sets to 3, they ended up with 2 4-car train sets they sold to Amtrak.
Oh.
One of which did go to Amtrak and was used as spare. The other one didn't make it. It got sideswiped by a Canadian National freight train in Montreal and caught fire and burned right down because aluminum melts. So that's a little divergence on some exotic railroad history. But in August of 1971, that train came to Tampa at St. Petersburg. I saw it at St. Clearwater. I saw it in Fort Lauderdale that August when I was summering there with my parents that summer. Later on, it was painted white with big red and blue stripes down the side, like the Amtrak cars have, and they built these arrows and these huge arrows on the side forward and going. Here's the more normal stuff that came in the 70s. That's the Champion. That's the golf course that's north of Cleveland Street,
Okay.
I believe. This is the station in St. Petersburg. Now, Seaboard and Atlantic Coastline, both of the stations near downtown, not too far from where the trop is. I guess there was this famous big shop down there. I can't remember the name of it.
Web City.
Yeah, yeah. I just came across that last year, so what the heck is that? And one of the stations was down
Web
there.
City.
Yeah, what was it called?
The Web City.
Web City, right, okay. Yeah, combination drugstore, emporium, and amusement center.
Yeah, and everything you ever wanted to do on a Saturday morning.
Yeah. So anyway, in the 60s, they built these stations. The Atlantic Coastline went out to here at 31st Street North. And looks pretty nice. Unfortunately, Amtrak stopped coming over in 1984 because they figured it was quicker to put you on a bus at Tampa Union Station to get you to St. Petersburg than to go all the way around through Oldsmar. The other thing, too, was Seaboard at the time, which is a Seaboard system. They said, hey, yeah, there's parts of Pinellas where the train did 79. You know, we don't have any freight business over here with the dam, so we're going to downgrade the track to like 50 mile an hour service or less. So they encouraged them to cut them back. And quite frankly, it gave Amtrak more time to service the cars to return and they sent them back north on the next trip north. And that's what it looked like in 1991 before anything was done with the building and all that. So it's just amazing how, 30 years later, less than 30 years later. But the station that was renovated, and it's been tenanted for a couple medical buildings, medical companies, I think a brewery was in there or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody's in there now. And out behind there, the platform's still rotting.
Yeah.
And then we have Tampa Union Station. That's the photograph that was taken by the station master early in the morning on May the 15th, 1912, the day it opened. 1 month after the Titanic sank. And just to give you a perspective, this part of the building is where the main hall is. That's about the width of the Titanic, and the tracks are about the length of the Titanic. Anyway, J.F. Leitner was the architect. He was out of Wilmington, North Carolina. He had actually also designed the Atlantic Coastline headquarters in Wilmington that was built around the same time. So I guess he had a bit of an in. And nothing to do with the Leitner Museum, by the way. It's a different Leitner. And we have the blueprints, and there's 3 individuals named on there. And the second one was W.L. Selby, who we knew was the chief engineer for the Seaboard Airline Railroad. He was in charge of all engineering, design, work, and all that. And so the other 2 were obviously the Tampa North and Atlantic Coastline chief engineers. Now, for those of the Tampa Bay, you may remember that there was a place called Seddon Island over in Tampa. And it's now Harbor Island. And that was an island that was built in 1908 when Seddon was the chief engineer. Railroads love to name places after their people, especially if they're presidents and especially if they're dead. Willard, Ohio. Willard was a former president of the Baltimore, Ohio, and I think it was named Willard until the town's name was after he died. Seton was still alive though when they named it Seton Island, I believe, as far as I know. So anyway, so that's a name that's got a little, Bay Area connections. The Seaboard sold. They built the island as a phosphate terminal, and then they pulled everything out of there in the 70s. They sold it for a dime, and then the real estate developers just made it done.
Of course.
Here's the station today. That's the photo I took. That's our friends at Tampa Union Station logo. This TUS here is actually what's up here up in the keystone on the top of the parapet there. And this logo was also embossed on the original doorknobs, which all got filtered. But we got 2 or 3 of them where we recovered on eBay and various places that are in the display, one of the display cases at the station. And of course, Amtrak is the tenant there. The city of Tampa owns the building. From 1984 to 1998, which coincided with the time that Amtrak moved their terminal operations for the Bay Area over there. Amtrak operated out of this. I call it Tampa Union Shack. The main building had deteriorated badly. It was owned by CSX, Seaboard, and they had no incentive. Amtrak's lease was next to nothing, and they weren't going to pay for the restoration. So, apart from building a maintenance base back there, you can see some cars are stored back there. They put this temporary structure on the bottom of what I call Platform B, which would be complete tracks 3 and 4. I should have put another picture in here, and maybe I'll add it down the road. That all got torn down after the main station was reopened in 1998. And they actually now have a high-level platform there where you can go up a ramp and walk directly onto the train. Mm-hmm. That platform had basically been destroyed. The original canopies were long gone. So Amtrak redid that one, and the new canopies, while they're steel, they mimic in shape, appearance, and color the canopies on the original 1912 canopies that are on the other tracks. That's the main hall looking north when the restoration work started. And it looked about that bad before they started working on it.
I was thinking this was a cleaned up picture.
Yeah, yeah. We got other pictures of before and after. Mm-hmm. This is 1968. You can see where that big green more shows more there on the Seaboard. Yeah. And it's a split image. It's a Seaboard paint scheme with Seaboard coastline lettering. For us train fanatics, Stan Jakowski was a friend of mine. That car is actually unique. It was actually originally a first-class buffet parlor car for the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. They actually started the train between Richmond and Washington. It was just their own. I think they called it the Old Dominion. And it failed. And so they scattered their cars out to other service on that railroad. And that car, which used to be a first-class car, was rebuilt into a baggage car. Well, you can't really stick to the blinder, but that's a baggage door there. And that was where the passenger baggage was. And the rest of the car was a dormitory space for the dining car crew. So it was rebuilt as a baggage dormitory. Went from being a real classy car to a workaday.
Yeah, working
man's car. That's the old canopies that are still on platforms A and C at Tampa Union Station. They call it umbrella style. This is a picture of 1984 of the stations off to the left here. This canopy work up there is gone. This canopy is still there and was actually restored by Amtrak. They do have to maintain what they still lease there at the station, and the city got on their case about it. They have to fix it. Baggage car, sleeper, lounge, 2 coaches. Sometimes you have 3 or 4 coaches. And these cars would match up with the minor cars up in the state. Now, the original preservation group in the 90s, we basically dissolved in about 2003. Mayor Greco loved what we were doing. Everybody else underneath them were like, good grief. The original preservation group owned the station. Mayor Greco wanted it when he came to the big reopening in 1998, and it ended up being given back to CSX and donated to the city. And everybody, the mayor just thought it was great, really cool. And everybody in the city was like, my gosh, what's the mayor done now? He saddled us with this old building. So after running into brick walls with a couple of people under Greco, the original group gave up. We reformed a new group in 2008 with the new subsequent administrations. and built a good rapport with the subsequent administrations. And from 2008 on, we basically were the foot troops that ran what started out as National Train Day, which was a concept promoted by Amtrak, and then after 2014 became Tampa Train Day after Amtrak decided to back off for budgetary reasons. So that first year when we had Amtrak actually brought a coach out of Miami that people could walk through, and the lights sent over to Thunderbug, which made me happy because I'm a huge hockey fan. And we had about 250 people come through that thing. We had a safety display and some models on display. And it grew and it grew. Whoops. In 2012, we had over 2,000. By then, Amtrak was bringing in a locomotive and several cars. We had some Superliners model train for 2 or 3 years, and these are the cars that run the Silver Mover and Silver Star. And this was one of their 40th anniversary locomotives, especially painted up in what they call a heritage paint scheme. And we had 2,000 people come through the exhibits that day. It's an open house. I mean, it is an active station. We had history displays and model train displays, and that's what we've been doing, ever since. 2014, we had over 3,500 people come through it, and it was one of probably the pinnacle of what we did, done over there. That corner over there, that's the same corner you saw all of the shambles that earlier photograph. 2017, we had about 2,000 plus. 2018, the exhibits outside and inside. Over here are the big benches and pastors then that day coming in was like, holy cow, what's going on? There's a party. Basically, we have it on the Saturday. We had it on the second Saturday of the month from about 10 o'clock to 5 p.m. in the afternoon. 2019, we actually marked the Golden Spike, the 150th anniversary. We actually had a recreation of driving in the last spike at Promontory Point, Utah, with some guys from the Florida Railroad Museum. And the Largo Central Railroad actually brought over this locomotive. That's a real operating steam locomotive.
Yeah, they do it every.
These are the guys from Largo Central Railroad. If you have never been there at the park, now one Saturday a month they're open, or one weekend a month they're open, and you can actually ride it.
Yeah, the first Saturday of every month.
Yeah, it's a blast. I've actually driven a couple trains around there. It's a blast. There's actually a Lego group, of course, it's actually kind of dissolved. There's a few members still. This was a Lego building at the station in Orlando, which was built in 1925. They've been telling me they're going to build Tampa Union Station for the last 15 years. I'll believe it when they finally see it.
Yeah.
That fellow there is Dennis Fernandez. He's with the City of Tampa Design Preservation Group. That's Jackson McQuaid, who's on our board of directors of Friends of Tampa Union Station. He's a VP with the Atlanta History Center. He and his dad were the guys who got the station safe in the 1990s. Oh, by the way, the whistle on this worked. They had this thing fired up, and the whistle worked. It was louder than heck. The last 3 years, of course, our Tampa training game got bugged by the wrong bug. We're hoping to come back big time next year in May of 2023 because it's going to be the 25th anniversary of the restoration of the station. And one of the things we've done, the city worked with us. We actually secured and got donations of money for over $170,000 to redo the baggage building there. It had been preserved as far as the structure, but never provided with air conditioning.
Right.
So we put in AC, redid the doors, replaced all the windows, fire protection, the whole works, and that's going to be available here in the near future for events and so forth. So we've been doing that. We've also worked with the city to secure another $2.5 million to also renovate the main building. It's been 25 years since it was done. And the previous administration didn't even repaint the window frames. So all the windows get replaced. They're actually falling out on the south side.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to figure out how when we did the baggage building, they let us select the contractor and manage it. And they're kind of so pleased that they avoided some of the bureaucracy because that 2.5 million, 20 million, 20% would just disappear into the city, not even go to the station. So they're trying to figure out a way where we could either lease it and do the project ourselves or something. So we're working on that. That's fast track. Sometime next year we'll probably start. Sometime this summer though, the place is going to get intended for termites for a couple of days. And Amtrak is just freaking out as to what they're gonna do about that. So we continue to work with those guys on that. Like I said, next year we hope to be back big and strong sometime in May. It'll be the 111th birthday of the station. And there's our pitch there, TampaUnionStation.com. That website's not as nice as the Seaboard Atlantic Coastline one. But I think we'll get our guy who did the other society to redo the Tampa one in the near future. But you can go there and make some donations and all that. And that's our plugging in for the Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airlines Society. That's it. Got any questions, Gavin? You're more than welcome to look at this.
But he does the, still does the Biltmore?
Still do the Biltmore.
He has some really cool pictures of the Biltmore.
I actually have the little model of that engine right on the front there with those color schemes on it.
Do you? Yeah, the old one from the 70s or the new one that came out a few years ago?
I think from the 70s.
Yeah,
My brothers for years and years.
I will say this, that if you take Amtrak tomorrow on the Silver Star, the food is
Yeah.
edible.
Yeah.
It's not the worst ever offered in an Amtrak dining car. And actually, you're almost better off in coach class because you can't use the diner, you got to use the cafe car, where at least you can get a full salad and sandwiches and all that. The good news is, I just went up to New York and back on Amtrak. They are hiring chefs in Miami right now. So they're planning to bring back what they call traditional dining car service sometime later this fall on the Silver Star and when they reactivate the Silver Medium. So at least these beautiful new cars will have somewhat decent food to go along with it. And these are O-scale models, by the way. The dining cars that they just built are all named for state capitals in the East that their Eastern trains serve, because all these cars are designed to go into New York City. And this particular car is named in Tallahassee, by the way.
Okay.
So any other questions?
No?
Yeah, it was a lot, I'm sorry.
No, it's been a